along right now, and I'm going to introduce our next speakers for the panel on innovation strategy between Canada and the U.S. Our first speaker is S.A.G.E Greenwood, who is a recognized thought leader in public policy. She's a principal, in Denton's public policy and regulation practice in Washington. She is the co-leader of the firm's U.S. federal practice, as well as the firm's Canada-U.S. initiative. Alongside her will be Gabe Batstone, who is the co-founder and CEO of Contextaire, I hope I said that right, which is an Internet of Things software company developing intelligent personal agent that delivers curated insight to the industrial worker at the point of service. He comes to us with 19 years of experience in software development. If you could please help me in welcoming both of our distinguished guests to the stage, please.
History has made us friends. Economics has made us partners. And necessity has made us allies. Those whom nature has so joined together, let no man put asunder.
We stand together at a pivotal point in history. All that we Canadians and Americans and those who went before us have built, all that we believe in, is challenged as it has never been challenged before.
There is no such thing as a threat to the national security of the United States which does not represent a direct threat to this country.
When all borders become what the U.S.-Canadian border so long has been, a meeting place rather than a dividing line.
The benefit of Canada-U.S. trade has been extraordinary for Canada.
For the past 3 decades, the CABC celebrates the great partnership between our two countries and facilitates ongoing dialogue between the public sector, the private sector, and key leaders on issues of concern.
Great. Well, thanks for the video and thanks for the walk-up music. That's great. S.A.G.E's always got a unique plan. I present in a lot of places all over the world. In fact, presented, I remember, in Afghanistan in 2008 and 2009, a lot of different places. So you wouldn't think you'd get nervous, but I was sitting at lunch thinking, I'm with S.A.G.E. I'm going to be a bit nervous. You just don't know what you're going to get. So I think you will be very happy with hopefully what we talk about. We've decided to make this as conversational, hopefully, as we can, bringing in some different perspectives. S.A.G.E. obviously a great thought leader in the Canada-U.S. relationship and doing great things. And I hopefully can bring the small business, CEO, startup, lifelong kind of entrepreneur aspect of things as we talk about innovation, as we talk about some of the policy priorities also for the Canadian American Business Council. So we thought we'd use that as the umbrella, but try to make it a discussion, and please think about questions if you can. We'd love to have those at the end to, again, make this a dialogue. It's always tough to follow a former governor who had a great speech at lunch, so we'll do our best.
This is number 7. Can we get 2 mics going?
Hey, now we're going.
Magic.
Yep.
It always makes sense to suck up to the sound guy, so thank you. Thank you, Gabe. Thank you, everybody. My reaction to lunch is, when you're a former governor and a former ambassador, it means never having to say you're sorry for your shoes. So we love Jim Blanchard and really appreciated the dialogue with Chris Sands. Jim is a member of our advisory board, as are all the former U.S. and Canadian ambassadors, and it's always amazing to see him, as well as His Excellency Bruce Heyman. So the thing that struck me at lunch is that there was a lot of discussion from 2 guys from Michigan about the auto industry, and that makes sense because the auto industry is so important to the Canada-U.S. relationship and to our growth as modern economy. And today, I don't know if people know, is the birthday of the Ford Motor Company. This day in 1903, Ford Motor Company was formed, and they're another great member of the CABC. We are really blessed and delighted with our membership, including you, Gabe, also Kelly Johnstone with Campbell Soup Company. You saw some Campbell Soup cans running on the screen behind me, General Electric, which was mentioned earlier. So we are really thrilled to be affiliated with so many iconic Canadian and U.S. companies, large and small. So on the screen, there are 3 pictures. I just have to look at them to see if I'm looking, that talk a little bit about, or that tell the story a little bit about what we are. One of them you might recognize is Tom Brokaw. And I put the picture there because he came and spoke with us in Ottawa 2 years ago, and a huge part of what we do is dialogue between private sector, public sector, the media, the academy, civil society, and it was really great to have Tom Brokaw in Ottawa. The picture in the middle is just a couple of weeks ago in Washington. People know that's Navdeep Bains, the new Canadian Minister of Innovation, and Gabe will have a lot more to say about innovation a little bit later. And then, of course, we have Christina Parts-Nevelis and Gary Dewar, Canada's former ambassador. So that just, in a picture, tells you a little bit about who we are and what we do.
Great, thanks, Scotty. Maybe we move along. Hopefully the clicker is working there. I thought a good place to start would be talking about what are our priorities. Innovation is one, but there's kind of 3 key policy areas. And, Scotty, if maybe you'd like to, talk about those. Obviously, pre-clearance of the border, maybe more generally, would be one of those. What are your thoughts on that?
Great, thanks. So we do want to talk about our 3 big policy pushes, and several of them have either been mentioned specifically or alluded to so far in this conference. Management of our common border is enormously important to people personally and to the economy. I would say our 2 countries, have made great progress in the last 10 years or so on the movement of people. And it is really time that we make a lot of progress on the movement of goods. And again, a lot of people in this room have been working on this for years, and I wanted to mention it today because the new pre-clearance legislation, or new pre-clearance agreement announced by the President and the Prime Minister, which would expand customs pre-clearance beyond just the air environment, not just when you fly, but to all modes of transportation, requires enabling legislation. There aren't that many legislative days left in the U.S., so we hope that some legislation will get through, if not in this Congress, early in the next, on a bipartisan basis, and we're helping with that. But also, Minister Goodale announced in Canada that Canada is enacting its enabling legislation. It could be a little controversial up there because the way it will be framed is, if you want to travel into the United States, all of your personal data will be given to the Department of Homeland Security. That would be not the right characterization of border preclearance, and something that we very much support. Sound guys, I want to make sure both our mics work at the same time. Is that cool? So Gabe can...
Yep, I think we're back.
There we go.
On.
All right.
So that's, maybe at the 10,000-foot level, some very important strategic stuff related to the border. A word I learned from you that I didn't know before was de minimis. And you can also say that's pretty associated to the border. Dump the duties. What's that all about?
So we're launching a campaign, dumptheduties.ca. It's actually not up yet. It will be up any minute. And I announced it on a Facebook Live interview with Congressman Brian Higgins before it was actually up. So one of these days, I'll be at something like this, I'll announce it, and you'll be able to click on it, and it'll be real, probably in the next 72 hours. What it is this. When you shop, if you live in Canada, the United States, and you go across the border, as a lot of people do, you can buy things without paying a tariff, without paying a duty, under $200. If it's $200 less, actually, in the United States, the level is if it's $800 or less. So if you're going back and forth between Canada and the United States, you can buy things and you can bring them back without having to pay duties. So you can go to the Ohio State University store here for those Canadians, buy some things, bring them back, stimulate the local economy. That'll be terrific. If you live in Canada and you don't live near the border, and you want to buy something that you can't get in Canada and you want to buy it online, if it's $20 Canadian or more, you're paying a tariff to the government of Canada. And so a lot of our members and friends have gotten together, from UPS to Pitney Bowes to Amazon to eBay to Shopify to the whole online community that helps people in this modern day buy things online, including small businesses who stock their shelves by buying things online. And we're getting together to say to the government of Canada, how about you raise that so-called de minimis level to at least $200. So it's even with, you don't pay a penalty for shopping online. You would pay the same, you would only pay duties the same way as if you went across the border. So we did a little test drive of an online campaign, a social media campaign, right before Prime Minister Trudeau's trip to Washington, and 2,500 Canadians in 4 days signed a petition. So we are officially launching the petition through the House of Commons process. We've got a member of parliament that has hosted it, which is the procedure you go through on official petitions. The clerk of the House has accepted it, and we're just waiting for translation. And so again, that'll be any minute. And the minute it's translated and available, we will launch a social media campaign, dumptheduties.ca. We'll see if Canadians agree with us, as we think they do, that it doesn't make any sense to pay their government extra duties for the privilege of shopping online, and there certainly shouldn't be a penalty just for being Canadian that doesn't exist in Mexico, for example, or the United States. So look for that.
Great. So obviously the border has come up often, thick, thin, or in this case, I suppose, expensive. But if we move on, that's a nice segue, de minimis, into standards and harmonization more generally, right? The idea of having things be equal on both sides of the border. You know, what, from your perspective, are the key policy aspects to that?
So thanks, Gabe. So, wow, you're good at that. Clicking secretly, and it magically appears. So we spend a lot of time, our members spend a lot of time trying to think about ways to put efficiency back into the economy, to eliminate inefficiencies that exist over the years that really don't, differences, distinctions without differences. So I think we were pretty instrumental in around 2010 and 11 in talking to the governments about the notion of regulatory cooperation, and subsequently it has become a key part of the bilateral agenda. We think it's really important. We are pushing very hard to make sure that the President and the Prime Minister talk about that when they're together June 29th. We also notice and I think this was discussed a little bit last night, the reorganization, the bureaucratic reorganization that the Government of Canada has taken with respect to the Regulatory Cooperation Council Secretariat, some staffing changes. We have some concerns that we don't want to see momentum lost on that really important bilateral initiative, because it means hundreds of millions of dollars back into the North American economy, and it makes a lot of sense for business. It also, if Canada, the United States, and Mexico are going to be a model for free trade in the world, if we're going to say we know how to do this, and therefore in the globalized world you should base some elements of new trade agreements, if we ever get there, on NAFTA, then we have to get it right here. So that's the one thing. The other is standards. So regulations are government-imposed rules that you have to comply with, that for health and safety and all of that. Standards are the voluntary rules, and we were really pleased with the discussion yesterday talking about the misalignment of standards across provinces and states and across Canada and the United States. And there is a lot of fantastic work on the Canadian Standards Council site, as well as their U.S. counterpart, about how much efficiency you could gain if, for example, you're an appliance maker and you don't have to comply with 17 different, just slightly different standards and tests across different regions. If you could just test once and be certified throughout North America, that would help our competitiveness a lot. So those are two, regulatory cooperation, standards alignment, are two issues that we will continue to work on, and we appreciate all the work of all the organizations here. And that gives me a minute to just also thank Dan for organizing this conference. I think it's I echo the comments of Governor Blanchard and others who talk about how timely it is, how important it is that we all get together. So thank you, Dan, for that.
Yeah, I would agree. We really have to facilitate the dialogues among industry, government, and all the organizations involved if we're going to be successful, because they all play a role. So maybe if we want to move on.
So turning the tables, I'm going to talk to you. one of the things I love about Gabe, there's a lot to love, but one of the things I love is that he's an actual innovator. And I wonder, so several of us are policy influencers, and we talk about innovation. You actually have innovated. I wonder if you could tell us first a little bit about your background and the companies that you've started, and then maybe talk a little bit about the CABC innovation policy suggestions that we're making today.
Sure. So, my background is I'm in the technology space. I've been developing software for 20 so years. Not so much the smart guy. I'd say I've been lucky enough to work with and have smart people who've innovated a lot, and I'm good at managing them and running those companies. So I've started companies. I've taken over companies that other people started. I've merged small companies into big companies, and so lived my life kind of in that. And hopefully I can provide some of that perspective to the folks in the room. As they say, one of my favorite quotes is, where you stand depends on where you sit. And often, sometimes the challenge is that you don't get operational executives to sit in these rooms, right, and to share maybe some of their stories and some of the realities that they face out there. And it's hard to make decisions when you don't have that information. So I'm certainly always advocating to my brethren to make sure that they get involved in these kind of things to share their story. In terms of CABC, I think the three policies outlined there, and there. Please take a copy. We have a copy of the paper.
We do not want to carry these home, so they're right over there. It's online, but for dinosaurs like me that prefer paper, if you want something to read, please help yourself.
And so you can see the recommendations above. And so we took a lot of time, a lot of stakeholder engagement. They certainly don't represent simply, in my case, a startup environment. This is Fortune 500 CEOs. This is people from pharma. This is people from aerospace and defense. And I don't think any of it is particularly surprising. IP is obviously a huge issue. I will be on the innovation camp, of course, and talk a bit more about that. And we think that in the end, it's facilitating that dialogue and talking about these different priorities is critical if we're going to be successful. And so it's great to see all the talk about innovation. Certainly, you can't escape it these days in Canada, I can say. But I think at the end of the day, what is innovation? And I think Jason brought up some good points there. And the way I often define it is words matter. Right, and so, what is innovation, right? It's not simply science, and the first policy priority there, funding around science, that is important, but that's not the only story, right? Innovation, to me, is the application, right, of technology to solve a business problem, right? At the end of the day, many an engineer who've worked for me has been tired of me saying, nobody cares about technology, right? They want a solution to a business problem. It was the famous Harvard professor. I can't remember his name, so maybe he's not as famous as I think, but he had a great
Donald
quote.
Trump?
No.
Oh, not that Harvard professor.
Let's not get political. Yeah. Though I think that ship sailed at lunch.
Yeah.
Was that people don't want a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole. Right, the idea is we want solutions to our problems. And so I think that's an important aspect for those of us in the tech space, and to focus on that. And as someone who's always been involved in industrial software, right? So I'm not Snapchat or Facebook or any of the fun, cool stuff. Right? I developed, augmented reality and virtual reality solutions to fighter jets on the F-35, or working on F-18s in Cold Lake, Alberta. So very practical use of high industrial technology, aerospace and defense, energy primarily. So for me, that's probably the key aspect is rallying around a few themes and pushing those themes forward. But at the end of the day, business people, we're responsible, right, for creating jobs, satisfying our stakeholders. And I think that's one of the things that we can certainly look at in Canada, right, is I don't look to government to help me innovate, right? I'm an innovator. I create jobs, I create technology, and apply it to business problems. So I thought one of the things that might be useful is to share in the startup world, we often say, what keeps you up at night, right? So, so what keeps a startup CEO up at night? I can share those with you. But if I segue back one step to the words matter, there's a big difference, and I think that's important for this room, between small business and a startup. Right, they're both technically small businesses, but I think we use those words interchangeably, and they're very different. And so I'll give you an example. In Canada, right now, there's lots of debate about the Liberal government isn't going to put their small business tax in. They were going to lower the tax, and now it looks like they won't. And so I get a lot of phone calls from the media and oh, you must be outraged. Provide us a quote. Right, so if I was a small business, I probably would be outraged. I'm a startup CEO. I could not care less about that. because startup CEOs invest money. I'll be suffering tax losses, right, for the next 3 to 5 years. The tax rate's irrelevant to me. Now, if I was a small business, I care, but they're different. And I think my point there being we have different incentives. And if you want people to innovate, how to get a small business to innovate, which is a company that plans to always be relatively small, or you want a startup to innovate, they will be very different. And I think we could probably use some segmentation among when we talk about SMEs and small businesses. They aren't all the same.
Well, great point, and something new for me. I learned a lot from Gabe through our various conversations, email. One of the taglines that I learned was BLUF, bottom line up front. And so let me ask you, to put one of our bottom lines in the report up front, besides the segmentation of the difference, having policymakers and thought leaders understand the difference between what can help a startup and what can help a small business and what can facilitate a major multinational company continuing to invest are different things. So that's good. But another thing that we talk about in the paper, which I hope everybody will take a look at and give us your comments, critical comments, whatever kind of feedback you have. But one of the things, bottom line up front, that you taught us about is the culture, the risk tolerance or aversion in Canada versus the United States. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about risk and what that means for you.
Sure, certainly. I've started companies on both sides of the border. And so I've seen both the access to capital, the cultures, and experienced both those. I am Canadian, but I lived in Chicago. And despite my youthful good looks, I lived in Chicago long enough that the Big Ten actually had 10 schools. So for those of you from one of those schools, you'd understand.
Nobody gets it except for Jim Dickmeyer.
Yeah.
Where the hell are you, Jim?
I had to
Thank
do it
you.
for Ohio State.
Yeah.
So in Canada, I think we have this fundamental desire to de-risk innovation. Which is a circle that you can't square, right? Innovation carries risk. And so we're always trying to de-risk it, and that manifests itself in the way we design programs, in how we provide access to capital, and so much they'll often say, hey, what do you think of this program? I'm like, well, if I could answer all those questions and do all the things you asked, I actually wouldn't need your money. Right, so we have this desire, and we have to accept failure. And Canadians, I think, are not as accepting as failure. Right, in the U.S., when you fail a company, it's a badge of honor. You almost get a Boy Scout badge. In Canada, you'd put your head down and hope everyone forgot. And so that's just a cultural difference, and I think it's an important difference. And I think we could be more entrepreneurial as the business community. In the government side, I think we could be a little more risk tolerant. And it's under maybe you start a program and some will fail, and that's okay because some will succeed, right? That you have to suffer some failures to find a success. A quote one of my old CFOs had, because when you start small companies, they eventually become big. And so I had a CFO at one point, and she said to me, I'd rather be approximately right than accurately wrong. And I think in government we tend to sometimes maybe push a little too far to get more accuracy, and by the time you get there, you're actually wrong. And not because it was wrong fundamentally, it was wrong 2 years ago when you asked the question. But things change so fast in this technology world, I think we have to work in approximations more.
One of the things you said last night at dinner, which surprised me, had to do with the fact that you don't need people to code. And maybe you could repeat that story for everybody here. And it struck me because when we hosted Minister Baines 2 weeks ago in Washington, one of the things he said was for his own daughters, it's as important for them to code as to learn to read and write. And I thought that was a very modern thing to say. And I learned last night in dinner that that's actually yesterday's thinking. So maybe you could elaborate.
Yeah, I guess the underlying point is the pace of technology. I've been in technology for 2 decades, right? 20 years. I have never, and a few of the speakers mentioned it earlier, I think on a panel this morning, I've never seen technology advance so fast, right? It is obliterating everything that comes within it within years, right? As Mark Andreessen, a famous venture capitalist, said, software is eating the world. And it really is fascinating. How do you consume it? And in government, it's even harder, right, to keep up with it. So an example is we were talking about software, and there's a lot of, hey, every kid should code kind of initiatives. And the funny thing is, as a software CEO, I was thinking, I don't really look for coders anymore, right? I don't need them because software, right, apps are dead, right, practically from the next phase. It's all about bots, right? And so I hire people who write algorithms, right? It's about machine learning, right? It's about, so software developers will always have a role, but interestingly, right, the next generation has already started where I hope someone's teaching my 4-year-old, right, about machine learning, right, and artificial intelligence. Maybe for my 10-year-old, software is still a relevant thing, but that just shows you in one generation, right, from a 10-year-old to a 4-year-old, the world has changed. Right, and to give another example, iPads weren't around when the first boy was born, and the our other child, every time he touches any screen, he can't believe if it doesn't respond. It's just abhorrent to him, right, that you would have a screen that doesn't immediately respond to whatever it is you want to do. So I think the pace of technology is important, and that's why it was refreshing actually to hear people talk about Industry 4.0, or in the industrial internet if you work at GE is how you call it, the Internet of Everything if you work at Cisco. I don't really care how we name it, but I do think we all need to understand it and work with it in much the way that the Germans have embraced it.
So we want to open it up to whatever discussion anybody here would like to have. And the third idea kind of that you mentioned briefly in the innovation recommendations is the protection of intellectual property. And what we observe in the paper is that, and a lot of people may not know this, the pharmaceutical industry, we have members from aerospace, from all different sectors. We also have pharmaceutical life sciences members. The pharmaceutical industry is responsible for more R&D spending in Canada and around the world than the aerospace industry, which is shocking to me. Shocking to me when I see the F-35 pin on your lapel to think that actually life sciences innovation is worth a lot of money. So if you're Canada and you want to attract R&D dollars and you want to continue to find those cures, what we observe is you've got to also have a climate in which the discoveries are protected, that the intellectual property protection is there. And in the paper, we observe that Canada has made a lot of strides on this front, but there's a ways to go. And the particular thing that worries us is not a policy. It's not a piece of legislation. It's a judicial interpretation of patent policy. So we encourage the government to look at it. It wouldn't cost them any money. And in a parliamentary system, when you have a majority, it's pretty easy to get something done if you would like to do it. So anyway, that's one of the things that we look at. And I don't know if you have any other thoughts about the importance of IP.
Well, I think, obviously IP, is a double-edged sword, right? And you can argue both points of it. It's very critical. I think we need to inspire people to create IP, right? And the easier that you do that, there have to be incentives, right? And I think that's been one of the challenges for pharma. I think the underlying point there, ties a little bit to GE's CEO, famously said, every company is now a technology company. Right, I think that's true, and we too often want to bracket it, oh, you're a tech guy, so you must be from Waterloo or Silicon Valley, and that's where tech is. And the reality is that's not where it is, right? It's at General Electric, it's at manufacturers. That's where rubber hits the road. It's at where people do things, right? Where there are customers, as Jason talked about, which was nice. That's where it really happens, and so I think we need to stop looking at innovation, IP, technology as a sector, right? And actually, it's a part of all the companies that we work with, and that's where it gets implemented, and that's where the value is. And when people see value, then there's more incentive to create IP, and you'll get more IP.
One of the things that I think is, if I may say this, terrific about the Canadian American Business Council is we're able to get diverse views to agree on policy ideas, and that's another thing that I think is terrific about this conference. So in Washington, D.C., if you can get Microsoft and Pfizer on the same side of an argument, that's amazing, and you're likely to be able to persuade people. So we're in that business, and one of the reasons I'm so excited about this paper that I hope everybody looks at is it is the view of small startups, giant companies, multiple sectors, and we think the recommendations are eminently doable, and we're not asking the government of Canada to spend any money. We know they're committed to innovation. We know that the Canadian federal budget has a lot in it for innovation, so we really think there's an opening here. We think they're on a very good track, and we hope for the benefit of the entire continental economy, if Canada can up its game on innovation in the next 3 to 5 years, that it'll have a very beneficial effect in the United States as well as in Mexico. So with that, I will make a plug for a website that's live, and I think it might be on the last slide. we like to create news and information aggregators. So you might remember, or you might not, before Prime Minister Trudeau's visit to Washington, we had WWW-PMJT in DC, and it told you a lot about state dinners and what to expect. We now have this website that I think is above my head, www.3 Amigos Summit, and we welcome all of your organizations. If you want to post policy papers or memes or infographics or whatever you've got, we will load up our site, and we find it's a good one-stop shopping, because once in a blue moon, the White House press corps will focus on Canada, and they really like to have a spot to go. So we found that was really true with PMJT, and hopefully people will make use of this site as well as a kind of a public service to the North American community. Questions or compliments, as we say? I mean, Rick Takchik in the back, a colleague when we were both at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa, is never shy. So we might call on people.
And a neighbor of mine. Oh.
Oh, there we go.
What are the external factors that keep you up at night or you worry about related to your business? Not internal issues like losing a key employee, but things that really are outside your control but affect your business.
And tell us who you are, please, sir.
Scott Buer, Vice President of Sales with Bionics.
Fantastic name, by the way.
Absolutely. The conservative who was thinking about Hillary, I think, if I recall from lunch. Great question. So what keeps you up at night, which I don't think I ever got to in my typical rambling style. But specific to external, well, I think, there's three things that keep a startup CEO up at night, and the first one is that. So it's actually market problems. So at the end of the day, I have to track the market, because people are going to give me money when I deliver something that either saves them or makes them money. And so we're tracking trends. So for me, in the Internet of Things world, tracking the difference between the consumer side versus the industrial side, tracking augmented reality versus virtual reality, and how would that get applied in an industrial environment? What's GE doing? So when you're a small guy, you're kind of tracking the big guys, right? And how they're going, because a lot of innovation will start from some of those big shops. I have a piece of innovation they don't, but it only fits in relationship to what they do. And I think you can't develop standalone technology and expect it's going to sell. At the end of the day, someone needs to buy what you're selling. So for me, the thing that keeps me up at night is, how do I attach to the outcome economy? Right? For me, that's what's really changed in the world is we have an outcome-based economy. People want to buy outcomes. They're buying jet engines based on power by the hour. Right? So nobody wants to buy a jet engine anymore. They just want to buy hours of flight time. So as a technology innovator, how do I map to that? I'd say, so that's, so I'd say external problems are the first thing that keep me up at night. It's what I'm always thinking about. To give you a top three, the second one is talent. And so that's why it's encouraging to hear about labor mobility and the kind of issues that you're talking about, because at the end of the day, any company, and particularly a software company, is just a group of people. Right? I pay people for what's between their ears. And I need a lot of those people, and I don't really care where they're from, and I often need them quickly. So the harder it is for me to get them, whether it's an H-1 visa, B visa if I'm in the US, or if it's a temporary foreign worker, the harder you make that, the more difficult it is for me to be successful. So that's really labor mobility and talent. And then the third one is capital. Capital, not just simply venture capital or government, it's also sales, but money. As I'm apt to say, vision without funding is hallucination. So that's obviously got to make the top three.
So just to follow up on that, just to ask the blonde question, the difference between augmented reality versus virtual reality would be interesting. But before you answer that, the flow of labor and access to talent is something that's really important to us as an organization. And Ambassador Heyman mentioned earlier, after the Hurricane Sandy, when Canadian gas and electricity workers helped respond, and the governor of New Jersey declared Canadian Utility Worker Day. Just a little bit of the backstory on that. President Obama and Chris Christie were together after that terrible weather event, and the president said, we will make sure there's no red tape, and the governor hugged him, and that probably killed Chris Christie's possibility to ever be nominated as a national Republican elected official, again, by hugging President Obama. But one of the things that was interesting is the gas pipelines were compromised. So it was really important to get natural gas pipeline workers to shore up the gas pipelines. And the closest workers in the United States would have had to come from like Louisiana, Oklahoma. That's where the talent was coming from, and that was several days' drive. So Spectra in Union Gas in Ontario said, we're ready. We've got workers, they're ready to go. And they actually, the reason we got involved was they couldn't get permission to come across the border. And I thought, what in the blazes? It's a national crisis. It's an emergency. We need help. And so we talked to DOT. We talked right up to the Secretary's office. And DOT gave an immediate, whatever waivers they needed to get across. And then we realized that actually the problem was on the Canadian side, because there was an issue. The Canadian officials were saying, well, the U.S. doesn't respect the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and for example, for their utility workers, they have mandatory drug testing. And I thought, you know what, and we don't want you to have to be drug tested, that violates your charter. We thought, look, this is a crisis, this is an emergency, and so anyway, it all worked out, but it wasn't without incident. So when we say we're all about streamlining the border, standardizing regulations, making it easier for people to get across. That's really important in times of crisis, but it also would be enormously helpful in times when there isn't a crisis to force everybody's hand. So back to augmented versus virtual reality, what are you talking about?
So virtual reality is obviously you immerse yourself in a scene and you're not aware of the world around you. Augmented reality augments your world with those things so that you still see. So Google Glass is a great example of augmented reality, and virtual reality would be Oculus, to use things. Frankly, both of them have struggled in the consumer space, and they're much more valuable in the industrial space because you have a controlled environment where you can tell people what to wear. That's also helpful, and there's some real return on investment, right? There's value to be had. So that's the difference between those two. Subtle.
Outstanding. Any last thoughts before we wrap from you or anybody?
No, any other questions? Oh, we got Rick. Knew we'd get him.
Thank you, Scotty, for waking me up back here. I appreciate it. It was a wonderful presentation, and my compliments. I feel like it's old home week because, Scotty, you and I put in a lot of hours with Jim Blanchard back in the late 80s working on a lot of interesting issues. And Gabe, you're a neighbor of mine, so we're certainly...
And it was amazing because I was in grade school in the late 80s. So.
Oh, was you? Oh, sorry.
Prodigy.
Yeah, you were. Well, you were very, you were young in that position. But nonetheless, I'm really impressed with your study here with respect to innovation. And I'm just curious, in terms of your methodology, do you know to what extent you relied on U.S. firms versus Canadian firms, or what the composition of that makeup might be in terms of the input that went into the study?
So the authors of the piece are two lawyers in the U.S. who do a lot of global innovation work and do a lot of work for the National Academy of Sciences, for the National Council on Trade, and they looked a lot at Taiwan and at Europe, as well as Canada and the United States. So most of the work about Canada was done in Canada. So the Jenkins report, which was just updated, is a key piece of it. The Conference Board of Canada has done some important work. But I'm happy to, there are quite a lot of footnotes there, and I'm happy to put you in touch with the smart lawyers who wrote it, if you like.
Yeah, no, I noted the footnotes, about 132 of them, so obviously a very extensive piece of research, and my compliments to you. Hopefully that'll, the timeliness of it is great, because the Canadians are certainly looking for input right now, and perhaps this can help play an important role.
Thanks. Last word, are we going?
This will have to be the last question, just so that we can stay on track, please.
When Jim Phillips leaves the room, you know it's the last question. It's like Elvis leaving the room.
Hi, sorry, last question, but it's triggered off the comment you had said, Gabe, about failure in the U.S. is an honor badge, and in Canada it's a disgrace kind of thing. We continue to talk about how similar Canadians and Americans are. We just are divided by a line in the sand, basically. Yet there are differences, that being one of them. And sometimes we're so busy trying to make ourselves look the same that we forget to talk about or celebrate or honor some of the cultural differences. So do you want to talk a little bit about how some of those differences can actually create greater synergy?
Yeah, well, I think it's always valuable to recognize those differences and understand them. You know, from our perspective, hiring talent, different jobs, you know, Canadians are better suited for versus American. And obviously there's a cross-section, there's no stereotype that fits each of those. But I think there are definite differences, and we shouldn't try to claim to be the same. We're different. We have shared values. I think that's what we talk about a lot about CABC, right? The foundation of the relationship is shared values of democracy and freedom and equality. And but there's lots of differences once you go up there. And obviously, having lived on both sides of the border, I've seen some of them and experienced them. And you know, when I think if I bring it to innovation, you know, what's one of the big ones that I wish we could import into Canada, right, is this idea that we have I find when we think of innovation in Canada, we tend to think of science, right? People with propeller hats, you know, coming up with great ideas in labs, right? And I find in America, there's that, but there's also innovation starts at the market. Right, like it starts with a problem. So, you know, we have this, I find in Canada, when we talk about innovation, we always say science, right, comes up with an idea, and then how do we commercialize it and take it to the market, right? When often, in my experience, the best innovation comes the other way, right? I find a market gap, right, a problem that no one's solving, and that will define, though science will be required, but the science happens because of the problem, not the other way around, right? So if you think in Ottawa, Shopify, right? You know, Shopify is a great example to me, right? They started out as a couple of guys trying to sell snowboards, right? And now it's an e-commerce platform that just partnered with, you know, Amazon and is worth $1 billion, right? So that wasn't science. There's lots of science actually that has gone into and fuels their platform. Uber, right, is another good one. There's tons of actually high-tech stuff in Uber, but it just started out as a fundamental problem that they were solving in the taxi industry. So I think, you know, taking a more market-oriented approach, I think is probably the single biggest thing I wish we could bring to Canada out of the U.S., and I would agree that recognizing differences can go a long way to facilitating collaboration.
And just 10 seconds on the differences and similarities. We celebrate the bromance between Obama and Trudeau, and we talk a lot about the great friendship. CABC is coming out with a wonderful coffee table book next year to celebrate the Canadian sesquicentennial, 150 years, and it'll be presidential and prime ministerial speeches throughout 150 years. But one of the funny little fun facts that we uncover is JFK and Diefenbaker actually didn't get along at all. Chris Sands would know this, but a lot of people don't remember they didn't like each other. And there's a story, an anecdote about how JFK had allegedly written S.A.G.E on some notes about Diefenbaker and left them in Canada. And he was asked about that on his when he came back by the press corps. And JFK said, Diefenbaker, S.A.G.E? No, I didn't say that. He said, I think he's more of a prick. So anyway, on that note, we don't always get along, but we do now. So thank you.